We've got a special crossover edition of Locked On New York Rangers and Locked On Washington Capitals. We are teaming up with Dan Holmi of Locked On Caps to discuss Peter Laviolette's tenure with the Capitals, as well as what the future holds for each of these two teams. All that and much, much more on today's episode of Locked On Rangers and Locked On Caps.
You're Locked On the New York Rangers, your daily podcast on the New York Rangers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, welcome back, Ranger fans and Capital fans. Once again, a very special crossover edition here today. This is John Check with Locked On New York Rangers, joined by Dan Holmi of Locked On Washington Capitals. And we just want to let everybody know before we get started here that today's episode of Locked On Rangers and Locked On Caps is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. And Dan, pleasure to be doing this. You know, our first crossover episode together here, and no better time than, you know, with the Rangers about to announce Peter Laviolette as a new head coach, you know, the introductory presser and everything. And I want to talk to you because obviously Laviolette, his most recent tenure was with the Capitals, and, you know, a little bit up and down. I feel like with the Rangers right now, there's a feeling among the fan base this is a very safe hire. Doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad hire, but I want to kind of go back in time to when the Capitals first hired Peter Laviolette. How did you feel about that, Dan, at the time? Was he your top choice, or how did you feel? Just general thoughts on the initial hiring of Laviolette.
I mean, I was excited when they hired him. It was a team that was kind of in transition. You know, they won the Cup in 2018, and then they were still looking for that coach to try to get the most out of this era, this Alex Ovechkin era. So they went out and hired Peter Laviolette. I thought it was a good choice. And then you take a look at it; he is 8th all time in wins. So I mean, these guys don't necessarily grow on trees. So I was happy that they were able to get him on this team.
Yeah, he's a little higher up there on some all-time lists than you might initially think. But, you know, he's done a lot of winning and taken 3 different teams to the Stanley Cup Finals. And, you know, when I was looking at potential new coaches for the Rangers, I knew he had a good record, but it's very impressive. I mean, he's pretty much won just about everywhere. But, you know, with the Capitals, obviously 3 seasons there for Laviolette, make the playoffs the first 2 years, but they go out in the first round both times. And this most recent season, they missed the playoffs altogether. So, you know, very broad question here, but, you know, why do you think that maybe it just didn't work out between Laviolette and the Capitals, you know, during his 3 seasons there?
Well, towards the end, I think that he ultimately lost the room just because of his coaching style, his reluctance to want to get younger. That is some of the things that are often said about him. But an interesting thing that I'd heard about it is he said that obviously you didn't pay attention to my history because I integrated a lot of young players when I played it or when I was the coach of Nashville. But just this past season, I guess I would say the myriad of injuries. This Capitals team was missing a lot of players, most notably Tom Wilson, John Carlson, and Nick Backstrom for good chunks of the season. 3 huge pieces to this team. So to try and plug and play players from AHL affiliate Hershey Bears had some kind of mixed results. There was never any cohesiveness between the lines in the deep pairings there. So I think it was a team that was kind of disjointed. And then also when he came here, he was up against it right away when it came to COVID. So that was always my assessment of Peter Laviolette is the writing was kind of on the walls. I knew that there was going to be a change. It was going to need to be made here. This was the first time they missed the playoffs since 2014. This team, kind of like a lot like the Rangers, had as a pedigree of making it to the playoffs and doing big things. But, you know, that was my tough assessment on Peter Laviolette is I wish they would have given him another opportunity just based on those facts of all the injuries, based on all the facts of COVID and how he was kind of up against it the entire time. But for this team to miss the playoffs, I think that was too much for GM Brian McClellan, who in a lot of ways, I think his job is on the line based on the next head coach. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So for this mandate to win, and ultimately they didn't get their objective, and it was to even make it to the playoffs, period.
Yeah, that was actually going to be one of my next couple of questions here. But just to confirm, if it was up to you, Laviolette maybe gets, I mean, I know his contract was running out, but, you know, that happens all the time with coaches, and you can always, you know, come to an agreement to keep somebody in town if you want them there. But, yeah, if it was up for you, I mean, does Laviolette get a mulligan for what happened this past season? You mentioned all the injuries to all the veterans and all the leaders in that room. A lot of really important players missed some significant time. So, I mean, if it's up to you, you know, Dan, you're the GM. Do you bring him back for at least one more season, Peter Laviolette?
Speaking personally, I would have. I think he's a great coach. I mean, again, his reputation precedes him. He's the winningest U.S. born coach. He's ranked number 3 in all active coaches out there. So again, these guys don't grow on trees, and his resume, like I said, speaks for itself. So I would have given him another opportunity. But the thing that I thought to myself, just looking at Peter Laviolette, the man, removing him from the capital situations, I'm like, he's going to find a job somewhere else. It's not like this guy kind of backed into a head coaching position. This guy has been killing it on every level all through his head coaching, winning a Stanley Cup in 2004 with the Hurricanes here. So I had no doubt. But, to answer your question, I would have brought him back at least for one more year, see what this team looked like with Wilson, Backstrom, and Carlson ostensibly in the lineup as long as they don't get injured again, to just give him, his fair due.
For sure. And, you mentioned something a minute ago about him, working with young players and how he had success with that at Nashville. That team was very young when they went to the Stanley Cup Finals under Peter Laviolette. And I want to ask you about that in more detail in just a second. But first, Dan, I think we should let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On Rangers and Locked On Capitals is brought to you by Game Time. Buying tickets to your favorite events should not be stressful. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. With killer deals on last-minute tickets and their best price guarantee, you can stop stressing over the tickets and start getting hyped for all the fun that you are about to have. Game Time is the place for last-minute ticket deals. Forget planning months in advance. Game Time has deals on tickets right up to the day of the event. Get exclusive flash deals on tickets for football, basketball, baseball, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. The Game Time guarantee means you will always get the best price. If you find tickets in the same section and row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. It's the fastest growing ticketing app in the country for a reason. Get images of your seat before you buy so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. Snag the tickets without the stress with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. And Dan and I would certainly like to thank everybody for making Locked On Rangers and Locked On Capitals your first listen every day. Both shows free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. And Dan, to just kind of get back to the Laviolette discussions here, I mentioned this just a second ago, but obviously the Caps have had kind of a veteran team this last handful of seasons here. A lot of the core from that team that won a championship a few years ago still in place. Were there any success stories, or how did Laviolette do with some of the young players that the Capitals have had, over the years that he coached there?
I mean, he definitely has helped out a lot of the career, most notably Dylan Strome, who they kind of picked up as a player to replace Nick Backstrom during his hip resurfacing procedure. He came here and just kind of lit it up and kind of really solidified his spot on this team. And one of the things that Peter Laviolette did is take his game to the next level. He kind of entrusted him with more responsibility, and he took that responsibility and ran with it. So I think that, he can work with your team as well, with the veterans, and kind of subtract the rookie part of it. I think that there was a mandate on him to get wins ultimately at the end of the day, and I think that Peter Laviolette did the best with what he had on this team, and it was a team that was injured for a lion's share of the season.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mentioned this a second ago too, very briefly, but I went back and I looked at some of the rosters that Peter Laviolette has had, and I really focused in on the 3 teams that he took to the Stanley Cup Finals, and it really is interesting. They mostly were young teams, or at least had a good amount of young players, and, a lot of them went on to great careers. Some of them are still playing even today and still doing a great job in this league. So, that was one thing that I think pleasantly surprised me as far as Peter Laviolette, the fairly strong track record that he has with young players, developing them and seemingly getting the most out of them. But I actually wanted to ask you a question about the veterans, because there's some, I guess, concern from Ranger fans, or some uneasiness about Peter Laviolette, very fiery personality, very demanding coach. He's a no nonsense kind of guy. And then you've got players on the Rangers, veterans like Mika Zibanejad, Chris Kreider, Artemi Panarin. They're all leaders in their own right, but they're not exactly. I think the term I've been seeing a lot is fire and brimstone kind of players, yelling and screaming and everything. So I'm just wondering, like, how did his personality mesh with, the Ovechkins, the Backstroms, the Carlsons, et cetera, all the veterans and the mainstays on that team?
On breakdown day, they all asked all the players what they thought of Peter Laviolette, and I didn't hear anything disparaging about it. That could have been a good opportunity since everyone kind of knew Peter Laviolette was out the door, that they kind of really put the dagger to him, but no one did. Everyone spoke glowingly of him, most notably Ovechkin, Wilson, Backstrom, kind of the pillars of this team, John Carlson. I don't think that he ever had any issues in general, but I think that if there was the dig, it was the youth thing. But as far as Ovechkin and the veterans, he always had a good rapport. And I mean, just take a look at this last season and all that Alex Ovechkin did, moving past all those milestones. And Peter Laviolette can use that as one of his feathers in his hat, as he was the head coach while Alex Ovechkin was breaking all those records. So, but I think that he had a good rapport with a lot of the veterans. The only thing that I heard negatively was by Dmitry Orlov after he was traded out, that he was kind of, didn't understand why he had the lineups quite the way they did. But I'm going to say in total, if I'm going to paint this with a broad brush, the team overall liked Peter Laviolette. It's just he was kind of dealt a bad hand.
It's interesting to hear you say that they kind of went to bat for him, toward the end of the season for the most part. I mean, you mentioned Orlov, but that's just one player. With the Rangers, nobody said anything bad about Gerard Gallant at the end of this past season. Not really, but sometimes I feel like you can almost say a lot without really saying a lot. Jacob Trouba said nice things about Gallant, but felt like he was kind of holding back and not really going all in. Nobody really went to bat for Gallant. And I like Gallant while he was here. I'll be, forever appreciative for that run that they had 2 years ago. I mean, he takes a rebuilding team to within 2 wins of the Stanley Cup final. So, that was a tremendously fun run for Ranger fans. But, the Rangers not the only team here with a new coach, Dan, and I wanted to get your thoughts. Certainly, we'll get back to Laviolette in a second, but while I'm thinking about it, let's talk about Spencer Carberry. What are your thoughts on bringing him in? Obviously, kind of a bold hire, just 41 years old, and his first time as a head coach in the NHL. So, any thoughts on him and what he could bring to the Capitals?
Well, it's a bit of a contrasting difference. I'll speak briefly on Laviolette. Laviolette's mandate was to win games, to get the most out of this 2018 Rock the Red era. But things have changed. This is a league that has gotten younger and it's gotten faster. And I'm so sick of hearing it as a Caps fan about how geriatric this team is, that there has been a bit of a different mandate for Spencer Carberry. Of course, the above all end all is to win a Stanley Cup, of course. But there's also been a mandate by GM Brian McClellan on the new coach to bring along the young players, to get younger, to get faster, to finally bring that to fruition. We've heard about it for the longest time, but then you had Barry Trotz and Peter Laviolette, two coaches that were a little bit reluctant to bring along the younger players. So I think Spencer Carberry, based on his history with the AHL Hershey Bears, the ECHL Stingrays, he has a rapport with the Capitals' younger players that I'm excited at the possibility of what can be. The Connor McMichaels that are down in Hershey to finally get their opportunity to not just get a sample size on the big team, but to get a long look. Oftentimes they like to bring these players up and use them as healthy scratches up in the press box, but nothing's going to stunt or stymie a player's growth more than to watch the game up on top or relegate them to the fourth line in a position that's not native to them. So I think give Connor McMichael, I'm talking about the Caps here, a nice long look. Ivan Miroshnichenko, a top draft pick who's going to be in the Bears, potentially the Capitals this season. I'm excited at the possibility of having a head coach for the first time in quite some time that will finally utilize some of the youth and also, play in, of course, with the veteran-laden core as well.
For sure. And to get back to Laviolette for just a second, Rangers and Capitals over the years, they've had a very spirited, very intense rivalry, a million meetings in the playoffs, all sorts of crazy things happening, 7-game series, going to overtime in 7 games, just a great rivalry. But for me, that rivalry between the Rangers and Caps almost, and not just for the Tom Wilson stuff, we can talk about that. That's a whole nother episode if we ever want to do a deep dive on that, Dan. But yeah, I mean, I just felt Laviolette got there and the Capitals, not that they were ever like what I would call a soft team, but it just felt like they started to play with such a mean streak and such an edge. And Rangers Capitals games, even this past season, I thought tended to get, pretty nasty. And that's kind of been Laviolette's MO, is that his teams are hard to play against. And, you're going to be in for a fight when you're going up against a Laviolette coach team. Did you sense when Laviolette got there that this team got a little bit more of a mean streak and played with a little bit more of an edge, or am I overstating that a little bit?
No, I definitely think that this team took its physicality to the next level. Again, like you mentioned, Tom Wilson, who's just intrinsically a physical player at the time, Garnet Hathaway, just to be that intimidation factor. I think to a certain extent, you saw the Capitals minus Tom Wilson, their biggest physical piece out of the lineup for a good chunk of the season. And you saw a lot of teams try to take advantage of the Capitals because they knew they were missing a lot of their physicality. I think that they tried to remold certain players to be those physical players. See Anthony Mantha, who is a big gangly guy, but not intrinsically a tough guy. But I think that Peter Laviolette does like to push the buttons. I think he likes to push the agenda of being a tough, strong team if he has the players at his utilization. I know in previous seasons you've had Reeves and players like that kind of bring that physicality as well. But I think that will be one thing that will be big for the Rangers is their physical presence. And if they're the physical players on the Rangers, he's really going to dial it up and make it a Rangers team that is going to be one to be feared. Because to a certain extent, you took a look at the Capitals, a lot of, like you were speaking of, didn't want to play the Caps because of a certain physical aspects. He is going to dial in the physicality of the Rangers player and make the Rangers a team as well that's going to be feared and you better not mess around with.
Yeah, I think that'll be music to the ears of a lot of Ranger fans. I mean, you know how it is in this league, Dan. Everybody always wants to get a little bit tougher, a little bit more physical, a little bit grittier. And, I think the Rangers, one of many teams in this league that could stand to benefit from that. And if Laviolette's going to instill that in them, I think that's certainly a good thing. What else did I have for you here? So, I've always just kind of gotten a sense with Laviolette that he tends to just, kind of go with the guys that are playing well on that night. I was watching a couple old episodes of Road to the Winter Classic with the Rangers and the Flyers, and that's been fun to look back on. But it seems like he kind of just defers. Like he's not too worried about a player's status or anything like that along those lines. It's more like who's getting the job done tonight, who's delivering, and they're going to get more ice time. I mean, is he still that way? Was he that way with the Caps?
Yeah, I mean, kind of like what we were talking about earlier. Everyone said, why not the youth? Because he wanted the sure thing. He wanted the Cap. Listen, he said, I got hired to win games for the Capitals. I didn't get hired to bring along the youth. And I'm sure it's going to be the same thing with the Rangers there, is that the Rangers brought him in to win games, period. He's not going to worry about, individual player stats and that kind of thing. I didn't think he ever really catered to Alex Ovechkin. I just think that Ovechkin is just that kind of player. He makes it happen. So I think that, that'll be the same thing with the Rangers. His above all end all is to make the Rangers the top. And they did really well last year. I mean, that you cover the team, but not good enough to take them over the top. I think that Laviolette, at least potentially on paper, could be that head coach to take the Rangers to that next level.
Sounds good. And I figure we can keep everything rolling in just a second here, Dan. We can do just some general, Rangers, Capitals talk, what's the future hold for both teams and what they might do in free agency. But would you like to let everybody know about our wonderful sponsor, Birddogs, before we do all that?
I would. I love me some Birddogs. And why do I love them? Because cargo shorts. Let's face it, you should have thrown those things in the garbage 20 years ago. Birddogs are made out of stretch khaki shorts. They're designed to fit slimmer through the thigh and leg, giving you a truly sculpted look. Birddog shorts do the exact same thing as Lululemon, but fit way better. They fit way better than regular shorts and are made of a stiff, restricting cotton. Birddogs fixed this issue by inventing cloud knit fabric that look just like khaki but stretches, so they give you a way slimmer look, and that's what it's all about, looking fashionable now these days. So go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNHL for a free Yeti-style tumbler with your purchase. That's birddogs.com/LockedOn for a free Yeti-style tumbler. I don't know about you, but I have been using my tumbler every day, put my coffee in it on the way to work. It keeps it nice and warm all day. You won't want to take off your Birddogs. We promise you.
All right, and I figured, Dan, we can go ahead and keep everything rolling here. Just with some general Rangers and Capitals talk to kind of wrap up our first ever crossover episode together here today. And, one question that I for sure have about the Capitals, obviously we've talked about this on and off throughout this whole episode here, but a lot of that core from the championship still in place, Ovechkin, Backstrom, Carlson, Wilson, Kuznetsov. So, I mean, do you keep rolling with this team? Is there any idea of maybe looking at a rebuild given the fact that these guys are starting to get up there a little bit? Or do you kind of, go all in and let this team have at least one or two more shots out of here, given the fact that they somewhat recently delivered a championship?
So the mandate that's been put out there by GM Brian McClellan and Ted Leonsis, the owner, is a retool, not a rebuild. There
Right.
were certain promises that were made to Alex Ovechkin that he would play on a competitive team. He doesn't want to be on a team where he's, playing with a bunch of unknowns and not getting him to his goal to win another Stanley Cup. Some of the things that he's talked about is, of course, I want to pass and beat Wayne Gretzky, but I also want to win more cups within the next 3 years. That's what he's under contract. He might get an extension there, but those aren't going to be his prime years, suffices to say. So that's what the Capitals are going to do. They are going to integrate, pieces here and there. You saw what they did with Dylan Strome and Connor Brown last season. Then there was the mid-season acquisitions of Sonny Milano and different players like that during the season. So I think that you are going to add small pieces, not anything major. You're not going to see a tear down to the studs rebuild, at least until Alex Ovechkin is done. And Brian McClellan has done a pretty good job kind of taking these players that are kind of unknowns or diamonds in the rough. Nicholas Aube-Kubel, another guy that kind of came to this team, got an extension, and just finding really great players on the cheap. Because as I don't know how your team is, but the Caps are up against the cap, so they don't have a lot of flexibility that way. So it is going to be interesting at free agency to see what this Capitals team does to try to get them over the hump to be the next best team, making it to the playoffs, period. One of the interesting things is everyone talked about, are they going to be able to make it past the first round? As it turns out, the Capitals didn't make it to the playoffs, period. That's my goal for this team next year, as at least to make it to the playoffs and hopefully a cup. And I think they're going to have to make some changes to do that. But I think that is what they're coming up. There's going to probably have to be some big pieces moved out to bring some big pieces in. The scary thought is some of the names that I'm hearing out there that might potentially be moving out to bring those pieces in. That's an interesting thing for the Caps.
Yeah, for sure. I think the Rangers and Caps are in similar situations in that both teams are pretty tight up against the salary cap right now. And, there will be some patchwork in free agency, but I don't think you're going to see either team do anything, ridiculously splashy. And, you mentioned just making the playoffs. That's something that I preach on my show all the time is that, right when we think we know what's going to happen next in this league, we get the Florida Panthers knocking out the Bruins and making it all the way to the Stanley Cup finals. Or, years ago, it's not that long ago, maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, we get the Blue Jackets sweeping the Lightning right out of the playoffs. We get the Canadians going to the Stanley Cup finals. So you just never know. When you get into the dance, for sure, anything can happen. As far as the Capitals, though, there was one player that played for them the last handful of seasons, was traded near the deadline this year, and that's Garnet Hathaway. He's somebody that I actually talked about in a recent episode. I'm kind of trying to pinpoint different Ranger free agent targets. And I think he would be a good fit, just a blue collar, hardworking player. So I know I'm not the only Ranger fan that's interested in Hathaway. Obviously, he played for your team for a couple of years there, Dan. So what can you tell us about Hathaway as far as, what he brings to the table? And, is he that guy that kind of plays every shift like it's his last and just gives you an honest effort every night?
He leaves it all out on the ice. And if the Rangers are lucky enough to get Garnet Hathaway, you're getting one heck of a hockey player. He is a great player in general, played on the fourth line, kind of a really great Capitals fourth line, along with Nick Dowd, and kind of mix and match different players there. But what you're getting is physicality, but also he brings a certain skill set of just getting under the team's skin. A chirper. Being a good chirper is kind of a subtle talent to have, getting in the ear and just kind of really rattling someone. Sometimes you don't know what they're saying, but you can tell it was something that really irritated him. But he is that physical presence, kind of like a Tom Wilson to a certain extent. But I don't want to pigeonhole him into being just like this goon. He also is a legitimate great hockey player in general. So I think if the Rangers are looking for a toughness, I think that Garnet Hathaway would definitely fit that bill. And I think that he could be another player that could help take the Rangers over the top if they're looking, especially under a Peter Laviolette, being that there's a rapport there of a physical presence. And I think that oftentimes a physical presence sometimes is bigger than a lot of other things out on the ice. And I think that Garnet Hathaway has that.
Yeah, it's hard to know what to expect from free agency this offseason because it's not the most star-laden free agent class that we've ever seen. And so in some ways, maybe that's to the Rangers and Capitals benefits because they don't have a lot of money to spend anyway, and there aren't these star players available. But then again, it's well, there aren't that many great players there. So our team's gonna overpay and overextend themselves for somebody like Garnet Hathaway. Does he end up getting the kind of contract that would price out a team like the Rangers? It's going to be very interesting to watch. Is there anybody that for the Capitals that you would like to see them target in free agency? Having looked at the class and everything, anybody that, or even just a type of player that you think that they could stand to add?
Well, what they've talked about is adding a top six guy, a forward out there, so it's not just Alex Ovechkin scoring goals out there. In previous seasons, we've seen Evgeny Kuznetsov be top three in goals, along with Tom Wilson and Alex Ovechkin, respectively, were the top three a couple of years ago. I guess I don't know a name in particular. There's a lot of names being swirled out there, but just another guy on the team that could score goals on a regular basis. That's the big thing. Let's face it, the future of Evgeny Kuznetsov is kind of unknown on this team. He has mentioned that he wasn't happy here, that he wanted to leave. Even then, when he was kind of cornered on that, he said that he had no comment. So I think, especially if you potentially could lose someone like an Evgeny Kuznetsov, bringing in someone else that can score the kind of goals that he can when he's playing in top form. But he's another interesting player. Just to talk briefly here on potential trades, as if we didn't get the production from Mantha, we didn't get the production from Kuznetsov. If we could wrap them up in a bow and send them out of town and get someone great, that is what the Capitals would be looking for, something like that there. But the biggest thing, they pretty much took care of the blue line during free agency, or the trade deadline, excuse me. So that is pretty much set for me right now. It's getting another depth forward scorer, someone else that can score goals on a regular basis.
It makes sense. I mean, I think that'd be a nice addition for the Capitals. I got one more question for you, Dan, and then I figured we can pretty much call it, but we'll definitely do another crossover episode in the future. This has been a ton of fun. But you touched on this briefly. Alex Ovechkin sitting on 822 career goals, 72 behind the great one. Give me a prediction. Does he get there? Does he pass Wayne Gretzky, most all-time goals in this league?
Well, he is revered as the Russian machine that never breaks. That's what he said one time. The biggest thing that would potentially hold him back is injury. He's not the kind of player that gets injured too often, but, Father Time is coming for us all, and we've seen him getting injured more and more these past couple seasons. I do think that eventually he will do it. He is projected to do it in the 24-25 season. I really hope that he can do that. If he continues on the pace that he has done, even this last year, I think that it'll happen quite easily. And the interesting thing is, people are talking about, is he already the greatest goal scorer of all time, being that he is playing against goalies that are bigger and that kind of thing. They're, and just better goalies than they were years ago. So Alex Ovechkin is doing it in an era where goalies are much better than they were years ago. Is he the greatest goal scorer of all time? Potentially. But to answer your question, I do think that he can pass Wayne Gretzky. I'm going to stick with that projection of 24-25 season, and it'll be a special day for Ovi and the Caps.
It will. It's going to be fun to track it. And I hope that it's one of those things that, increases the popularity of hockey. I mean, this is one of the big ones. This is one of the big records in sports. And, a lot of people thought that it would never fall. And Ovechkin, he's clearly at least got a shot at it. And it's going to be fun to watch and see how it plays out over these next few years. But, Dan, I figured we can pretty much end there. But this was a ton of fun. And, I'm all for doing another crossover during the season as long as you're up for it.
Absolutely. It was a lot of fun.
All right, sounds good. So, Ranger fans, Cap fans, thank you guys as always, and we will see you next time.